online as well for those who want to read the summary of what happened. Today's meeting will be hosted by my colleague Philippe Ster, who is one of the PhD students on the project. So I give the floor to him. He will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. Enjoy the coming 2 hours.
Yes, thanks a lot, Rutger. Yeah, my name is Philippe Ster. I'm one of the PhD candidates on the project. And I'd also like to welcome you to the second edition of our seminar series. Tonight's topic is stakeholder representation and CSR, and we want to ask how ethical obligations and the question of who should be involved or considered in corporate decision-making go together. And we're very glad today to welcome Isabel Ferreras and Nini Shi to speak tonight or today. Each will give a talk of roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of the time having an open discussion. Our first speaker is Isabel Ferreras. She is professor of sociology at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium and senior tenured fellow of the Belgian National Science Foundation. And her research is focused on firms as political entities from both the empirical perspective of sociology and the normative perspective of political theory. Among her publications are her book, Firms as Political Entities, Saving Democracy Through Economic Bicameralism, and with Elaine Landemore, In Defense of Workplace Democracy Towards the Justification of the Firm-State Analogy. And yeah, with that, I'll give the floor to Isabel Ferreras.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Rutger. It's very good to see you all. Very pleased to be with you and thrilled to share some ideas about the question of the day. I chose actually as title, Workers Are Not Stakeholders, to make it very clear, and I will try to develop that thesis. As a way to handle this like constant flow of Zoom meetings, I thought I would not share slides, but I have put my outline in the chat so that you know how I'm going to go, and I hope to keep it that way, as lively as possible. So I have 4 parts in my remarks. I dutifully followed the instructions that Philippe sent, actually. So he raised those questions. So who gets a say in the corporation? What is the firm? How to democratize corporations? And what do we do with the stakeholders? So let me enter the first question. Who gets a say in the corporation? Well, obviously shareholders. And that's meant to be the case. Corporations are the legal structuring of capital investments and of their relationships with one another. And for actually more than 2 centuries since the birth of capitalism, societies have tried to have corporations consider obligations toward other, well, that was not identified as stakeholders, but other constituencies, other interests affected, that is workers, customers, the environment, the communities, and society as a whole. And I wish to point to this fact as we start this seminar. I don't think we can say that strategy of changing the structure of the corporation from within has been exactly working. And certainly the pace is not fast enough when you consider the threat that they represent toward the environment. You probably know of that amazing figure, 73% of the global energy consumption could be saved, according to engineers from the University of Cambridge, 73%, that three-fourths of the energy consumption globally could be saved by practically achievable design changes in our production processes. And these design changes mean actually labor-intensive processes. We have the technology today. We don't need new technologies to do that, but we need labor-intensive design changes. And that is actually an impossible bet in a world where corporations are in the hands of their shareholders, especially in an era of so low energy costs. You remember, as I do, that in the summer 2019, the US Business Roundtable expressed its new vision about the business responsibilities, and they really put an end to supposedly to the shareholder primacy era by defining their new vision about how they should serve Americans. That's the US Business Roundtable, obviously. And they voiced a shared fundamental commitment to all their stakeholders. And by stakeholders, they mean their customers, their suppliers, the communities in which the people work, the shareholders, I'm quoting here, right? And the employees. Do we seriously think that this new modern standard for corporate social responsibility, as they call it, can actually help societies to change course? I don't think so. It's very clear that this multiplicity of stakeholders conveniently actually put the CEOs back in the driver's seats, and the legal structure of the corporation as such ensures shareholders to keep their grip on CEOs' behavior. So we really have to think more, and we have to, I guess, address what I have called the reductio ad corporationem, which is this attempt to reduce the firm to the corporation and its structure. And the vision here is to embed the corporation in an institutionalized structure that is actually the firm. So let me turn to the second point. We need to step back to think about what is a firm actually. And here I'm taking stock of the work done in the legal scholarship by David Ellerman, Jean-Philippe Robet, pointing at the difference between the firm and the corporation. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that the corporation is indeed this legal structuring of capital. It's a legal concept. It really speaks to the group of capital investors who get organized via a certificate of incorporation and is granted a moral persona by the state to become a legal entity run by a board of directors empowered to mobilize the assets of that entity to enter into contracts, commercial contracts or labor contracts. To do what? Well, to develop a firm. That is what Robet calls building the firm around the corporation. Now, what is the firm? The firm is indeed a much larger entity than just the corporation. And it's one that's not yet properly understood. And I think it's the work of social science to really help understand, describe first what the firm is. And my account is that a firm is an entity whose existence depends on ongoing decisions about the goals of the coordinated actions pursued within that firm, which are bound up in issues of efficiency and justice, and depend on two classes of investment. Capital investments, obviously, for a capitalist corporation in a capitalist world, but also labor investments. And these decisions affect the lives of all those involved and actually some other, the famous stakeholders. So why do I use here the term of labor investors? This concept, I think, helps bring in the workers, which are central to the operation of the firm who actually constitute the firm. Without workers, there would be no firm. Like, let's take an example. Without the drivers, there would be no need for Uber Corporation. Only the day when obviously those cars will be operating, but this is not the day. Today, actually, cars need drivers, and no one would put any money in an Uber shares if it were not for those drivers to take their car and to drive customers. So the labor investments that is constituted by all these workers is the labor investments on which the existence of the firm depend. And yet these drivers are, as so many workers today, are considered or like commodities, exchange on in the specific case of the platform worker, gig work is really a commodity exchange on a commercial market, because there is no labor law that is actually helping them. So workers are not a commodity, I just said, but so what are they? Well, they are these labor investors, so who perform the investment that's needed for firms to exist. But when I say investment, I don't mean investment in the sense of the economic discourse. That is a quantified external thing, money, assets that are used as an instrument to obtain a desired external end. No, I mean investment in the sense workers are invested in what they are doing with their skills, with their time, with their effort, with their entire person, their physical self, their intelligence, their emotions, whatever actually the skill level or the recognized, socially recognized skill level. And this include also the care that they feel for their co-workers, for instance. And of course, in this pandemic, I think many have realized that. Teachers, delivery workers, nurses, cashiers, lawyers, doctors, computer programmers, like everyone, no matter how their job is perceived or remunerated, invest himself or herself, their mental and physical health in their work. And the concept of labor investors help bring all that. And the fact also that it's not actually the legal status, the standard contract employment or not, that these workers are granted, that actually makes them legitimate to have claims toward the firm. The very existence of the firm, whatever it is, whatever the structure of that firm is, depend on this labor investment. And when people do that, they actually mobilize their, as I said, all of their person, and they have a vision about what they are achieving together, or as a worker. And it should not be surprising that people actually, have a view about what they do and would like to have a say about what they do. And I love that example from June 2019, when Amazon workers in the US, there were 8,000 Amazon employees who signed a letter for the shareholders assembly to ask the company to align its strategy to the IPCC report in order to respect planetary boundaries. And of course, Jeff Bezos said that was useless, that he had a much better strategy in terms of respecting the environment. We should note that these workers were doing exactly voicing their views about, what is the firm about, what is their service about, and of course, a very recent example is the January 6th, the aftermath of the Capitol attack, and the fact that engineers at Twitter, at Facebook, and other social media platforms actually were instrumental in pressuring their CEOs to eventually ban the president of the US to use their social network. And that was based on their own views about, what they think, what they built should be used for. I call that the expectation for democratic justice in the workplace. And indeed, work is a political experience that mobilizes people's views about what is just and what is unjust. And we should not be surprised about that. And we should certainly do something about that. So I'm moving to the third point now. In the context of today's corporate world, it's very clear that workers, however labor investors they are to the firms to which they are so central, have no say in the government of their firms. It's in these extreme cases, as the January Capitol attack, for instance, that the engineers at Twitter eventually were heard. But actually, they were engineers trying to speak up for years, before Donald Trump being elected, and they were absolutely not considered. Their views about what the firm was about was not considered relevant. What we see today is what I think we should call economic despotism. That is, capital investors behave through the corporation as despots. They have all the means to organize the firm as they please, and they are the only ones to enjoy political rights. That situation is actually a very old situation, when one class, one constituency constituting the entity is having the possibility to dictate its rule on the entity. Well, this is the old problem of democratization. And that is the issue before us. So indeed, we have to wonder how in the past, an entity in the hands of one constituency, a property owning constituency, generally, like the patricians in Rome in the 5th century before Christ, or the lords in England, these people were actually the property owners. And they were the only ones to enjoy the political rights to govern the entity. And the question before us is, where is the House of Commons? Where is the ability for labor investors today to have a say in the government of that joint entity? In history, this has been done through what I call a bicameral moment, when the dominant group actually is forced to accept that the representatives of that second constituency will be able to veto its decisions, so that a second majority will be required to pass any decision. So the law of that entity now depends on a majority of the representatives of that second constituency to approve or veto the decision. And this is actually the principle that we put in the Democratizing Work Manifesto that I think some of you have signed last May, in which we actually identify that principle as a personal investment of labor, that is of one's mind and body, one's health, one's very own life, ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm. And you can obviously implement that in different ways. So let me just survey a few ways. One way would be to step up with the German Mitbestimmung way, where you have half of the board, which is constituted by workers' representatives, but you would grant that college of voters the ability to position itself at the majority. This is what the Clean Slate report done by the Harvard Labor and Work-Life Program actually suggested as the supermajority board vote mechanism to grant workers' representatives on the board the ability to have a majority inside that college of voters, so that would be needed to validate any decisions. You can obviously go with two chambers, taking, for instance, seriously the Works Councils model that we have in some European countries, or at the EU level, where you have a European Works Council for actually more than 1,000 firms today. The biggest firms present in Europe have the obligation to set up European Works Councils where delegates are sent by workers in the various countries where they are represented, where the firm is present, and these delegates meet the top management every year. It's certainly not a second chamber, a second board, but actually the channel for representation is there. It's just that it does not enjoy the same rights as the rights of the board. And you could also imagine other ways to go after a multi-stakeholder. That there, I think it would make sense to speak about stakeholders, cooperatives, within which you might find, and this exists, for instance, in France as a legal way to structure cooperatives, where you have representatives of capital investors, representatives of the community, representatives of many stakeholders, and a college of voters inside the board that is formed by the workers' representatives, those who are the labor investors in the cooperative. And that college of voters can be granted a supermajority vote as well. So let me turn to the last point. What do we do with the stakeholders then? I just said one word about that already. I think obviously stakeholders could be very relevant to be involved in the board on the side of capital. You might see, for instance, in Germany, lots of lenders, for instance, have shares in the corporations that are present on their territory, and they are represented on the board through having those shares. That's one way. Another way is also to include them in committees of the board. I think in that way, works councils today, as they work in Europe, are some form of board committees where through which various stakeholders could be brought in the governance of the firm and be granted the possibility to voice their views and to have the ability to voice their views about the decisions that the firm take, and that could even make compulsory to consult whichever board, whichever committees before any board decision. I just spoke about the multi-stakeholders, worker cooperatives, but I think it's very central also to this discussion. And the rise in the stakeholders attraction, I would say, is the fact that it reflects the weakness of our states. It's because states are somehow incapable to impose limits to corporations in terms of the social goods that they should seek, in terms of their internal structure, so that they meet the requirements of a decent democratic society, and so that they also meet the planetary boundaries. And I think that there, the discussion is certainly certainly closed with changing the internal structure of the firm and making it democratic, because the limits of the planets have to be imposed, obviously, also from outside the firm. And that is going one of the big battles of the future. But to achieve that, it's very clear that having democratized cooperation will immensely make the task easier, as these types of firms should have a much more cooperative relationships with democratic states. And I'm closing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Wonderful talk. Yes, we'll directly go on then to our next speaker. Nyanil Shi is Professor of Business Administration and Joseph L. Rice III Faculty Fellow at the Harvard Business School. And his research revolves around questions of business ethics, both in applied contexts like the employment relationship and regarding its normative foundations. For example, when it comes to weighing incommensurable values. Yeah, I'm very glad to have him here, for him this morning, for us this day. And Nyanil Shi, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And Isabel, thank you for your comments. So I actually agree with pretty much everything that Isabel said, and I'm sympathetic to that. And so what I want to do is maybe try to put what Isabel said into the question of what I understand to be today's theme, which is the relationship between CSR and stakeholder representation. So try to put a way to sort of see if we can't put a frame around that in relationship to what's just been said. And secondly, to introduce a few caveats focusing on the idea of the corporation in terms of our discussion as opposed to the firm. And the third one is to raise some questions about the claim for worker participation in the management and governance in firms, because I'm very sympathetic to that idea, but I do think that there's some things that need to be worked out in terms of the argumentative structure for thinking about those issues. So that's kind of what I hope to be able to do. So if we think about CSR, and basically, so roughly, I'll sort of tell you the sort of the three broad claims that I want to advance, and I think they're quite sympathetic and similar. The first is that I think there is a claim on the part of stakeholders broadly construed to have some claim of representation in the firm and in the corporation, right? Whether that's through consultation, whether that's through, as Isabel mentioned, participation in the board. And I think, and that I think it actually relates quite closely, that claim, to arguments for CSR. But I think the claim for workers to participate and have representation in the corporation in terms of decision making is different, for exactly the reasons that Isabel mentioned. But at the same time, I think that that argument for why the claim for workers to participate in the governance of corporations, to have representation, while it's different from that of other stakeholders and different from the argument for CSR, that's where I sort of struggle, and I think there are a lot of objections that people raise that sort of need to be addressed. So that's kind of where I want to sort of take the conversation. So if we think about CSR, right, as it's sort of broadly understood, I think one way to understand it is in terms of activities or constraints on activities at the corporate level that need not serve a commercial function and may not necessarily be there for commercial success. They might be helpful for commercial success, but they're not necessarily required. And I think that's where Philip, you mentioned this idea of sort of moral obligations on the part of corporations as related to what's going on in CSR. So if you think, for example, with regard to the environment, right, on the side of constraints, not engaging in pollution, right? On the positive side, it may be, introducing more carbon friend, introducing alternative forms of energy, for example, as sort of Isabel mentioned. If we think about the supply chain, right, a lot of CSR is focused on the either sort of setting minimum standards, right, for workers in the supply chain, or sort of eliminating, say, for example, child labor, or alternatively thinking about trying to improve working conditions, raising wages, and things like that. So that, I think, and similarly, if you think about communities, CSR might be something like donating money to help improve local education, right, in the United States or in other countries around the world. So those are examples, I think, of what we commonly call CSR, activities that either are sort of negative in some sense, right, sort of constraints on corporate activity, say, for example, no child labor, ensuring certain working conditions in the supply chain, or what you might broadly call sort of positive actions, say, for example, changing one's energy supply or providing money to schools. And if we think about the sort of the ethical arguments behind that, right, if that's the way you sort of frame CSR, I think the negative kinds of CSR, I think, roughly can be framed in terms of a kind of protections against violating certain important interests on the part of other stakeholders. And in terms of the positive arguments, I'm just going to put it out there, I think roughly we could sort of make some kind of argument on grounds of beneficence. So if that's the case, I think that the kind of representation that stakeholders could claim reasonably would be with regard to protection of interests, right, with relationship to negative CSR. And so that probably could be done through institutional structures, but when states are weak or there's a lack of legal enforcement, we could make arguments for some kind of consultation process or something like that. It's a way to sort of protect and ensure that important interests aren't being harmed, right, by corporate activity. And that could even be true even under well-functioning states, right? It may just be, right, that the nature of the legislative process or the enforcement of laws is such that there are certain decisions that come up that may take time to go through the legislative process. And so even in a well-functioning state, you could imagine a kind of need for a consultation process with either local communities or participants in the supply chain or consumers to ensure that important interests aren't being harmed by corporate activity. So that's a kind of, I think, corporate representation or stakeholder representation in corporate decision-making that I think comes out of a concern with CSR. That's what I'm doing. Now, if we think of workers as stakeholders in that kind of context, there's certainly many important interests on the part of workers that require protection, and certainly lay grounds for claims to some kind of consultation in the decision-making process of the corporation. And in some ways, I think works councils could be defended on those grounds, right? Other kinds of consultation process could be there. But overall, the representation that we're talking about is what you might call kind of a protective or defensive kind of representation. And so that gives rise to, I think, the second point, which I think is very similar to along the lines that Isabel has mentioned, which is that the participation of workers, right, in the firm is different from different constituencies because of the productive process and the idea of investments. Right? And so that gives rise then to a distinct claim, right, for representation in the corporate decision-making process. And I think that's sort of where Isabel's remarks sort of mainly focused. But before I go there, there's sort of one caveat I want to introduce for the point of representation, right? If we look at US law, right, the way in which fiduciary duties are sort of specified for directors of corporations is that they're to act in the best interests of the corporation and its shareholders. And it's not about maximizing shareholder value. It's not about maximizing shareholder welfare. It's about acting in the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders. And so you could imagine, as sort of a caveat to my first set of remarks, a situation in which we re-specify what it means to act in the interest of the corporation, right? And acting in the interest of the corporation could include, right, not just sort of protecting interests, say on the part of the local community or the environment, but actually could, in some sense, require specifying the interest of corporations, actually also advancing those interests as well. I think that's sort of the idea, and that's the way to understand, I think, as Isabel pointed out, the Business Roundtable and sort of this idea of stakeholder capitalism is sort of trying to redefine, in some sense, what it means to act in the interest of the corporation and sort of promoting those. And I go back and forth on how helpful an approach that is. And I think, Isabel, I think you raised those points as well. It, in some ways, it just simply gives a lot more discretion to managers and directors in ways that may not hold them accountable. But at the same time, we could imagine, you know, the rest of corporate law is meant to hold managers accountable with regard to their fiduciary duties on the part of shareholders. So you could imagine a system where we redefine how we understand what is in the best interest of the corporation and introduce some sort of institutional accountability for it that wouldn't just be about sort of protective representation on the part of stakeholders, but also actually more active representation where they can advance their interests alongside those of shareholders. That's sort of the one caveat I wanted to put in there, that as we could think about the problem. Okay, so what about worker participation in the management and governance of corporations? Here's where I think things get a little bit tricky, and I'm going to just put it out there, so I think we can discuss it if that's okay. Which that if we drill down on why is it that citizens, let's say in a political context, have a claim to participate in state level decision making. The two most, I think, common answers that are given from political theory are, one is something like people who are affected by the decisions undertaken by the state ought to have some claim to participate in the making of those decisions. But if we take that view as the grounds for a claim for citizens to participate, there are lots of interests that, if we go back to the CSR view of participation, that also seem to be just as important as worker interests. So why wouldn't they also then have a claim to participate in decision making, not just in the protective sense that sort of is there, but also the sense that sort of grounds workers as additional claim to participate in the governance of corporations. So that's sort of one kind of puzzle I think that needs to be teased out. The second one is to say, well, okay, so maybe the reason that people have a claim to participate in democratic decision making is sort of basically an autonomy-based view that sort of this is an extension of an exercise of autonomy. Again, if that's true, we have to then separate out why that applies to workers in a way that it doesn't apply to others. Now, I think the idea of investments is important, but there are other constituencies that also, I think, engage in a certain kind of investment that may not be dissimilar from that of workers. So take a local community, right? A local community where they have a long-term investment in local corporations. Should they have a claim to participate then in the governance of the corporation, not just by being shareholders of the lender, as sort of as Isabel pointed out, but actually directly because they're also in the same way as workers making those kinds of investments. So that's the other kind of question there. Where I've landed myself on this issue at the end of trying very hard to sort of defend this, and I see people on the seminar here who actually have challenged me on this point. I'm looking at Professor Moriarty, for example. Is finally to say it's something about, and I'm just going to throw this out, it's a very half-baked idea. I would love to engage in this conversation. It's something about status equality in a democratic society, and it's very similar to the idea of there being class interests. And I think there's something to be said for in a capitalist society, an economy, in a democratic system, if the productive process is mainly meant to serve the interests of capital, there's something inherently unequal about the status between labor and capital in that society. It's a very basic idea, nothing deeply catalyzed. My own view is that argues for something like Rawls's property owning democracy, right? A broader distribution of the ownership of the means of production in a society that allows for private ownership of the means of production. I think that's where it leads to. The question is, does that then lead to also changes in the internal decision-making structure of corporations? And that's the part that I'm not sure the connection between thinking about the level of status equality at the level of society. I think it can get you something like Rawls's property owning democracy. That seems to make sense. But whether that then takes you back inside the corporation into sort of a bicameral decision-making process, that's the part that I'm not so sure about. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Minhee, for this fascinating talk. Yeah, so now the floor is open. If you want to raise a question, just raise your digital hand and I'll note down your name, and then we can all discuss these two great talks. Okay, first question is from Tully.
Thank you both for those wonderful presentations. I have two questions for Professor Xie for his just 2 points in his talk, which I think may help if he could clarify some points that he made may also help stimulate discussion. And there were 2 points where I thought there was a possibility that we end up sort of avoiding some of the key questions that Isabel was raising, and these had to do with the corporation having interests of its own, and also with status equality. So with the first point, and this is just really a request for clarification. I mean, it would seem to me that the corporation just has no interests as such that are in any way specifiable, sort of independently of some determination about like which participants in the corporate enterprise are to have their interests represented. I just would like to know how that isn't a way of displacing the question of whose interests count, because the corporation is a legal fiction. So what are we actually talking about when we're ascribing interests to it in a way that's somehow independent or different from deciding in advance which participants in the corporate enterprise ought to have their interests served. And then the second point is about status equality. So it seems to me like when there's when defenders of the claim that there is something distinct called status equality, which justifies democratic forms of organization, that's somehow different from a distribution of power or something like that, or a distribution of possibilities of freedom or something like that. The claim is usually like, status equality involves either asymmetries in power or asymmetries of de facto authority or something, or asymmetries of consideration, in the sense that I think just means, some people, it is presumed, and the institutions are kind of set up to operate as if some people's interests prima facie just matter more than others. So I'd like to kind of know a little bit about what Professor Xie thinks that pursuing or justification strategies based on status authority wouldn't also just simply kind of put us back in the question of, well, who should have which degrees of power inside the relevant associative domain, in this case, the corporation, or whose interests ought to matter more, capital or labor or something like that, or who should have de facto authority within the firm. I mean, it just seems to kind of, again, resolve back into questions about some of the issues that Isabel raised. I hope that's clear. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Should I respond, Philip, or how do you want to do this?
Yes, we do one by one.
Great. Good. No. So good. That's great. So I think the question about the corporation's interests is a good one. And is it just devolved then basically to figuring out who should have some sort of say in the corporate decision-making process? I think that's your point. And we sort of specify that's corporations. I guess part of it harkens back to a slightly more old-fashioned view of the corporation, in the sense that, right, historically corporations were, the corporate charters were granted for some kind of purpose, right? So whether the purpose was to have a bridge over the Charles River in Massachusetts, or whether the purpose was to, some corporations like the East India Company. But the point is that there was a purpose that could be specified for the corporation, right? That just wasn't simply about making money for shareholders. And if we think of that idea of a purpose, then I think we can start thinking about, well, what kinds of, what interests does the corporation have in achieving that purpose? Right? What are the things that it has to do to sort of achieve that purpose, right? So that's sort of one way to think about redefining the purpose. And certainly if you listen to especially non-Western business leaders, right? They sort of, they view their corporation as kind of, a sort of founder of Panasonic in Japan talks about it as a sort of a public vessel, right? The corporation is a public vessel that is meant to sort of advance sort of interests on the part of society. And it's not just a question of decision making. It's just like, that's just what it's about. Or if you listen to the Tatas in India, right? They talk about the corporation as really serving the national interests, right? So I think if we ascribe to the corporation a sense of what its purpose is, you can actually talk about corporate interests that aren't just simply about which individual constituencies, right, who are contributing or engaging with the corporation have some say with regard to the decisions. So that's sort of one small point. We can talk about that later. In terms of the your point about status of egalitarianism, what does that do? That's, I think, exactly why I'm not sure, or I wonder about whether the concern with status egalitarianism at the social level among citizens in terms of the division of the ownership of productive property and labor carries over into decision-making within the firm. I think that's, maybe if I understood your point, I think that's the part, because once we sort of look at it within the firm, then it may just devolve into either is it some kind of version of asymmetry of power? Is it a question about interest being affected? Is it a question about sort of being able to exercise autonomy, in which case, and it's not clear why workers have a special claim there. I think it's really only at the level of society that we can sort of think about there's something special about the division of labor and distribution of ownership of capital. So that's a very, very small point, but I'll sort of leave it at that. So I see other hands on it.
All right, Isabel, would you like to add anything to that?
Sorry, not yet. I'm listening. Thank you.
All right, then next on my list is Tim Christians.
Yeah, thank you both two for your talks. I have a question for Isabel, more specifically on the exact, let's say, institutional mechanisms by which you envision this what you've called the House of Commons for labor, in the sense that you've mentioned lots of examples that make use of labor representation. So hence, so for instance, the German system of Mitbestimmung. And so then the question, of course, becomes, how do you make sure that the representatives of labor actually represent the interests of or the preferences of the workers in that specific firm? You could see it as a bit of a mirror image of the agency problem between shareholders and CEOs. And for them also, the problem is, how do you make sure that managers actually perform the interests of shareholders? And so you could say, well, on the other side then of this bicameral system, you would have the same problem. So hence the question would be, what mechanisms do you have in mind to align the interests of labor representatives to those of labor itself?
Should I answer, Philippe? Yes?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I guess and this is one of the beauty about thinking about the democratization of the corporation, it's that it brings you back to all the issues that are valid or as valid in the context of the democratization of the polity. And so this very old question of the representation is obviously like a question that will have no end. It's one of the constant work of improving the conditions of representation and making that link between the constituency and its representatives strong, and at the same time to enable some leeway to the representatives. All these issues are as valid in this context. Obviously, I think, so that's a second dimension in my response. I think we should not reinvent the wheel, and obviously look at what are the mechanisms already in place in societies where there is some form of worker representation. And this is why obviously the case of works councils is so interesting, because this is really the intuition of a second chamber for workers to choose to send their representatives. And where you have that in countries like France or Belgium, you have an election day that is, under the monitoring of the state, which what's the word? Sorry, my English is disappearing as I speak, but which make it compulsory for firms to organize these elections. So it's not like if they don't want to organize that election, like it's a battle in the US currently for workers who wants to get represented by a union in countries like Belgium or France. Obviously, it's compulsory. It's part of the law, and so I think we should build up, of course, on this. Where there are traditions that exist, we should build up on that and grant more rights attached to these institutions. But the very question of the quality of that representation is certainly a constant concern, and I think also all the thinking that is actually developed in the literature, in political theory, in political science around participation, all the work of Hélène Landemore about, her last book about open democracy, I think are very relevant, because we could also imagine that, a sortition would be actually a good mechanism for choosing workers' representative. But I think one key dimension here will be the role that unions could and should still play in the context of worker representation, because unions in societies where there are free unions are the ones who are capable to organize the solidarity trans firms, so across those firms. And this is very important. So for the project of democratizing corporations does not become a project of corporate patriotism. That would not be very helpful, I think, according to the ideal, which is to deepen democracy, like if I refer to Eric Olin Wright's work, for instance. But I'm closing here.
All right, Ninja, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no, just very quickly. So while I'm sympathetic to greater worker participation in the governance firms, I guess I have gone back and forth on how much of a parallel there is between the case for workers and the case for political citizens to have a claim to participate in the state. And I go back and forth. I used to think that was a compelling argument. I'm not so sure now. I do think that there are differences between states and corporations, or states and firms, and sort of why now certainly you might look at the practice, right? the practice of how we elect representatives, or the practice of how we do things in the political sphere, those practices, right, may find expression in the corporation or the firm, but I'm not sure that the argument for those practices carries over. And I think that, for me, is at least the challenge, I think, for those of us who are committed to this idea of thinking about worker participation. At least, I sit in a business school. I spend a lot of time trying to explain to people some of these ideas, and I don't think the political argument is exactly, and for other reasons too, independently. I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. So.
All right. Next.
Yeah, sorry, Philip.
Yeah,
May
sure.
I add one follow-up comment on that? Because I do fully agree with what Nien He just said. I think it's not so the analogy between state and firm is not what would be let me phrase it differently. I don't think the case for democratizing the corporation is strong if it is made in a parallel way as in the state. I acknowledge I am the co-author of a piece about that analogy and trying to vindicate it, but it was meant with Hélène Nannemore to actually get the attention of political theorists and political scientists to tell that community of thinkers, you have to think more about the firm because this is in your realm of expertise. It was really a call for the political philosophy community to really take to consider the firm in its realm of expertise, and in that sense, I think we have been helpful in making that happen, and it's really fantastic to see how today there are across the world many more political philosophers thinking about the stakes within the firm. But that said, I fully agree that I think the point is that firms are another kind of political entity. As states are a kind of political entity, and firms, corporations are another kind. And actually, in terms of analogy, for me, what might come to the closest is more like the city. It's certainly in terms of the architecture. Democratic society, I don't see firms as being as important as states. And even though we know that the revenues of firms might of the biggest corporations today exceed the GDPs of countries, it's nevertheless not appropriate to think that these corporations should have equal status to these states. So obviously there might be a fundamental misunderstanding if when people think that we're making like the direct analogy. I totally agree with you, and I think so some more work has to be done to legitimize the claim for workers to indeed have rights within the corporation.
All right, then. Next on my list is Chi.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel and Nihar, for your great talk. It was very inspiring. So following both of your response to the previous questions, my question is really like, when we talk about workplace democracy or stakeholder democracy, one of the central issues is really about how to define the boundary of the demos, right? Because granting decision-making right to one party, but not the other party, means including a certain interest perspective and excluding certain interest perspectives. And similar to like political democracy, there must be normative principles behind the boundary of the demos. And that is a very puzzling question in political democracy, as well as in workplace democracy. So my question is really for both of you, like, what are your cards on the tables? Like, so what are the normative principles behind your theory of stakeholder representations or workplace democracy, right? Because like the dominant view, shareholder primacy, there are two arguments, right? The first is the ownership arguments, because shareholders are the owners of the firm, therefore they ought to be given the exclusive rights to vote. But we all, or at least most of us, would agree that legally that is not sustainable, because owners of shares is not owners of the corporations, they are different, right? But there is also normative principles, which says that because shareholders are residual claimants, therefore they bear most of the risks. So because they cannot protect themselves through contract with the corporations, and they're the residual claimants, so they are the least advantaged in the corporate context. And therefore, they ought to be given the exclusive rights to vote, right? So framing in this way, we could see a kind of like Rawlsian spirits behind the shareholder primacy. Although descriptively, we could contest the account that whether shareholders actually the least advantaged. But normatively, the principle is that the one that bears the most risks ought to be given the right to vote. So I would like to hear more about like, what's your view on these normative principles, as far as what do you find to be the most convincing normative principles that should be used to define the boundary of the demos? Thank you.
Would maybe Nyenhi go first?
Sure, great. So this is actually really important. So I should pick up on the point that I made earlier. I don't mean to say that there are no good arguments for why workers should have a claim to participate in the management governance of firms. I think what I should have said is that what's hard is an argument that grants workers that claim in a way that then doesn't expand the demos. So I think maybe that's the way I should frame it, right? So if we're worried about protecting of interests, there are all sorts of constituencies, right, who are affected by corporations that have just as much claim to have their interests protected. And if that's a claim for worker participation, then they should also these other interests. Right? So I think that's exactly the kind of split. So I think that's right. Okay, so that's helpful. The next best argument, I think, is this idea, and this I think Isabel talked about this, which is this idea of being a residual claimant, right? And so there could be two models. There could be a model in which workers actually don't make any firm-specific investments. You don't care about whether you're at firm A, you're firm B, you don't care who your other workers are, you don't learn how to do things in a firm-specific way. So you don't have any real, you're not you, she, but the worker is not invested in the way that they have firm-specific investments that make them sort of vulnerable as a residual claimant. But you could also imagine a system, right, where a situation in which the worker has very much made all these sorts of firm-specific investments, in which case, yeah, they actually kind of look like a residual claimant in a way that the shareholders, right? And I think that's the impetus for, you know, the team production model. I mean, that's the kind of way I think which a lot of people think about this idea, right? But then I said in my talk, but then if that's true, then isn't the community also a kind of also a residual claimant in the same kind of way, because they've made a lot of firm-specific investments in the corporation that, and so then again, the question of the demos comes in now, right? Gee, I think that's right. So at the end of the day, I think, at least for me, this is where I've landed and sort of struggled, is that it comes down to what it means to be engaged in production. And what is special about work, and sort of like go back to say Hannah Arendt, like the idea of sort of human engagement and activity, right, in a way that transforms the material world around us, in a way that then could be sort of benefit somebody else extrinsically. I mean, so there's something, I think ultimately it has to come down to something like an account about what's distinctive about work in the production process, where the production process is understood as something very socially valuable and necessary. And that's going to be the way to try to articulate some kind of principle for why you might have an argument for including workers, right, in a way that doesn't extend to other constituencies in the same way. And I'm sorry that Jeff Moriarty jumped off here. He has a paper in 2010 where he sort of lays out this whole structure of why fetishized work. So I think that for me is where the answer is. So, Isabel, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Certainly very close to what you just said, but I would probably anchor this in Marx, in the young Marx, and in the realization that work is a human experience through which I express my individuality. And so alienation, the process of alienation, is really the process that workers go through as they work for a capitalist firm, where they have no access to bear on the ends, on the finality of their work. They become alienated. They are pursuing ends that they don't have a say over. And this is normatively what is not acceptable. And this at the same time explains why workers have this very special status, because they are the ones who are governed by the firm. You know, the community, consumers are not governed by the firm. The labor investors are the one who are governed. And so to me, it's really more than making an investment that's specific to the firm, although obviously that literature can kick in. But I really think that what's crucial, and here maybe it's too much to ask that we use the term investment as well, to refer to the fact of being really investing your own self. So it's not about investing skills, you know, or having made an investment to acquire skills that you can transform into some human capital. It's really about being like, yeah, sorry, my daughter is entering the room, so I have to, okay, tu peux y aller, c'est pas grave, okay, ça va. But so, and let me just add another dimension that I wanted also to ask about that I wanted to say about the risk dimension. I think this is also, it might get confusing, but you know that when you buy a share in a corporation, you actually are protected. You enjoy some limited liability, and actually what you risk, all that you risk, is to lose the value of that share. When you think about that compared to what a worker risks, it's just incommensurable. A worker, even someone that, you know, a sociologist might think is not fully invested in the job and is doing that as just a gig, is actually, you know, investing his person, his time, his personal life and his health in the job. And so when really we would start to think about risk, I think there is a serious case to make here. It's not been done, and someone should do it, because that needs to be articulated, and obviously then challenge the very idea that the investors who matter as the capital investors. I think that's like the intuition driving the term of labor investors. The investors who matter are really the labor investors. These are the unique, weak actors that are actually crucial to the endeavor, and who are running a very high risk and are not covered for that risk, even though they receive some wage at the end of, you know, the whatever period of time. Yeah.
All right. Next on my list then is Konstantin.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, everybody, for, well, first of all, thank you both for the presentations, of course, and also thank you to the Corporatocracy team for organizing this event. It's always nice every 2 weeks to have these get-togethers. So I had kind of more kind of questions for Isabel, actually. So well, hearing you present, I can only find myself in agreement, and I found it very interesting. So when I ask 2 critical questions, it's more to kind of hear your thoughts on them rather than to say, I disagree, here are my questions. So it's just kind of to provoke your thoughts on these issues. So one of the things that we come up with, of course, if we look at companies with works councils, you look at Germany with employee representation. Well, Volkswagen was not an innocent company when they had scandals. So when even though you have this type of democratization, you can't have this, you nevertheless see that there are still corporate issues and difficulties. And I suspect anybody who goes for promoting democratization will still have to confront, okay, but what about the other cases where it didn't help or didn't work? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. And the kind of the second one actually builds a little bit on the question that she asked as well on kind of risk, where on the one hand, if you look at this kind of claim that the shareholders are residual claimants, I mean, they seem to assume perfect information for everybody in the world except for the shareholders. So, I mean, it's by definition that you'll end up with needing to protect them. But if you dive, at least that's how it seems, but if you dive a little bit more into economic theory, they would argue, I think, especially from a finance perspective, about, you know, Knightian risk and fundamental uncertainties in entrepreneurial decision-making and so on, which honestly, I think, as you're saying, it's not that compelling if you consider the level of risk an employee takes, right? So just, I think it's worth pointing out the information asymmetries that are literally assumed into the model, which I think is an extraordinarily political model. But if you look at the way that politics, that this politics is implemented in firm decision making, they tend to kind of do it along the lines of we're optimizing, we're maximizing kind of rationality and individual kind of self-interest and decision making behavior. And the idea is, of course, that this ultimately minimizes risk and promotes predictability. And so that an investor who's outside the company can look at the decisions that are being made and say, okay, they're maximizing accordingly. I know if I put X into the company, it's going to generate Y% returns, and I can make predictions for the future and so on. And as soon as you give employees some type of decision-making structure, their immediate response from their scientific premises is that you're introducing all kinds of uncertainties and unpredictabilities, which undermine overall investment. And of course, in the kind of paradigm of globalization, you then have, you know, these rankings for countries in terms of the doing business and this type of stuff. So even though I completely agree with you, actually, I think it would be good for companies and would lead to better decision-making, I would argue that what do we do then with such a, I would say, dysfunctional financial paradigm that doesn't even recognize the way that this can properly create value, but with this tendency for predictability would even punish it because it doesn't fit within their assumptions, if you see what I mean. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the first question, thank you for raising that example, the Volkswagen emission scandal example, because I think it's very illuminating for the fact that that is not a democratic firm. So what we know in Germany as a system is a system where in the board you have indeed half of the representatives who come from the labor side, but the president of the board is appointed by the capital side and has also an extra vote, which means that when they enter the boardroom, the capital side can always win the vote if they want to go for the vote. Of course, it has nurtured a very different type of culture, a culture of collaboration, of listening, you know, to the other party, the other side, and in that way, it really exemplifies that workers can, you know, be serious partners. Their representatives can really help increase the productivity of the firm, and all these sort of pro-competitive arguments that are relevant to this conversation, because obviously we want to be mindful of that as well. I mean, firms are about, you know, they are productive entities, and they are about producing something, a service or some production, and it would be foolish not to care for that aspect. But that said, I think that the culture that has been possible, so the culture of silence. We know now in the case of Volkswagen that dozens of people knew about it, and that there was no discussion about this in the open for years. That speaks for how undemocratic the structure was, and to me, I see this as certainly a wake-up call for German progressives, and I have a lot of interesting conversation with German scholars and partners who don't think anymore that Mitbestimmung is like the end of history in terms of democratizing the cooperation. I think it's an important step, but it's been 70 years now that this has been put in practice, and So democratizing the cooperation should go further, deeper, obviously, and this is about this collective veto rights for workers' representatives to have their voice heard. I think that is threshold for considering the firm being democratic. Now, on the second, on your second point, absolutely, I think we have to. But obviously we understand why it's not shared, but we are in a world of radical uncertainty. And as we are in this world, obviously, there is no way we can justify that especially workers are not going to be at the table to decide about the future. And I think one area in the economy, which I think is part of particular interest here and illustrative of how this is important to understand, is the development of artificial intelligence. We need to have workers who are actually developing these software to be able to bear on the development of these softwares in terms of the government of these firms, and not to be just instrumentalized to, you know, put the best of themselves to develop these fantastic, amazing AI codes, but actually be prevented to have their own views, their own ethical values to bear on the developments of these products. And from that perspective, it was very interesting, for instance, to see that at Google, they had a whole controversy about, you know, the Maiden project, which was about making the software program for the Pentagon to enable the US Army to develop this drone program to kill without any human decision at the end of the day. And eventually engineers at Google said, we don't want to do that. And that was 2 years ago. They wrote an open letter saying Google is not in the business of war. And that was eventually heard by the top management of Google in that case. And it's interesting to see why they did that, because I did some interviews, and one top manager told me we could not afford to so totally go against the ethical values of our engineers, because we need them to put the best of their mind into the product they're developing. So this understanding that radical uncertainty is going to characterize the future, certainly as we move deeper with the problems of climate change, grants even more right to labor investors in a normative understanding of the stakes. I guess.
All right, Ninhu, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, no, very, very quickly. So I think this is right. So I'm going to just throw out just two thoughts. I think this is exactly right. So on this question of workers bearing more risk, it's all exactly right. I mean, I think in contemporary developments, it might be interesting to sort of see where this whole movement, say in relation to what Isabel just mentioned on Project Mavement. But there's this whole movement now for ESG investors, right? Trying to push companies to take actions and strategies that are consistent with ESG. And if you push people on this, right, the question, well, why should it matter in them? And I think some people will mention something like a version of not wanting to contribute to ends that they find immoral or unjust. And if that's the argument that's made, why not extend that then to workers and say, well, then shouldn't workers also have a say in basically not contributing to ends that they find immoral or unjust? So that'll be interesting to sort of see, and I would love to sort of see somebody pick up that argument. On democratizing firms for workers, there's sort of two counterfactuals that might help push our thinking. So one is if we had a fairly egalitarian distribution of private ownership of the means of production, how much would we be concerned about what we're talking about today? That I think that's, for me, has always been a helpful way to think about it. Second one is, what if we had public ownership of the means of production? How much of the concerns that we're talking about within democratizing the firm would exist as well? And so I sort of throw those out as not as answers, but just as ways to sort of push our thinking on what I think is a very central problem.
All right, thanks. Then next on my list is Kinanya Pai.
Yes, thank you, Philip. First, I'd like to thank the speakers for their great presentations. It's very thought-provoking, so thank you very much for that. I'd like to respond to what Isabel has been said, but I'm curious about the response of both speakers. So, Isabel, my reading of what you've said is that like the common dual distinction that we know of shareholders versus stakeholders, I feel like what you're doing is that you kind of shift labors, like you mess up the categories in a way, and by doing so you empower labor, as you call labor investors. So you have capital investors, you have labor investors, and by mixing up the categories, kind of you allow for empowerment. If that's so, if this is the right interpretation, I'm very curious where that leaves other stakeholders, so the communities that we've been talking about, or society at large. And that ties in a little bit into what was just discussed just now about Volkswagen. So you said it's not a democratic organization, and that's okay. I totally agree with that. But what if it was? Would this accident, kind of this incident, then have been prevented? Because more democratic doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do the right thing. It doesn't mean that the environment is going to be protected. It doesn't mean that the communities are going to be protected. So I'm very curious what your thoughts are on like these other categories of communities, or like the bigger category of society at large.
Thank you very much for your question, and I certainly would love to come back to the previous thoughts, but let me get to your point, which is very important, I think, and this creates lots of misunderstanding when we're talking about democratizing the firm and not democratizing the corporation, right? So not making like shareholding more democratic, but really empowering workers. It's clear that this is not going to solve all the problems, and that human beings remain, you know, as failed and as bad and good as they are. So I think that the thrust of this is really to project the understanding of the firm as a political entity under a constraint of democratization, which leads to the realization that all the equipment that's needed in a society that think of itself as democratic, that is a free public sphere, that is, medias of communications, that is all that equipment is relevant to the existence of the firm. And so, for instance, I'm not saying that if Volkswagen was bicameral, that this scandal would not have happened. I don't know, but there are many dimensions of why a democratic infrastructure of the powers in Volkswagen would have indeed produced a very different result, meaning some people whom were very aware of this might have the leeway to speak. They might have avenues to do so. They might, they might have triggered debate, felt protected to do so if that was the values of the firm. So this is where obviously a discussion about structure also meets a discussion and also need a discussion about culture. You have to have both at the same time. So it's very clear that democratizing the corporation, if it's only about redistributing power and only that, well, it might not be very helpful. You really need the people to develop a culture that is attuned to that structure. Here I'm very Deweyan, as John Dewey saw democracy as a project and as a culture, but as a structure and a culture, and you need both. So that whole perspective, I think, is extremely relevant in the case of firms as well. Yeah, let me stop here for now. Thank you.
Then?
Oh, no, I'm fine. Let's go on.
All right. Then next on the list is Valery Senko.
Thank you. First of all, yes, I would also like to thank the presenters, and especially it's very nice to meet Isabel, because her book was, I was reading her book in my first semester of my PhD, so it is quite influential and inspiring. And my question is actually also very much connected to what Kenania just said about not only looking at sort of the labor investors, but what about the other stakeholders, as in, and a bit with the idea of comparing from a legal perspective or economic perspective, governments with companies. So my point would be more on, wouldn't it be better or more constructive to think about democratization of the firm, not from this legal perspective of governance and who is the firm governing, but where over whom does the firm has power, and sort of more topics of power, exploitation, influence, ecological impact as well in a local community, for instance. And in this sense, I would consider, for example, if a mining project would be in a rural, like a mining project in a rural area would have impact on health of the local community, but this local community would be excluded from some kind of a democratic process. It would be very tragic, to say the least, that we are only focusing on labor because labor is spending its health and like body on the corporate profits that are alienated from them. So yeah, and in this sense, maybe looking at the perspective of, instead of sort of the legality of things, but exactly like who does the company exploit and influence and has power over? And I think I had a different point as well, but I guess I forgot it already, but yeah, thank you. Sorry, of course. Maybe this would be in terms of democratization. Wouldn't it be also interesting to look at exactly what Rutger also presented the last time of the participatory democracy and sort of more progressive ideas of democracy instead of more classical versions of it for companies specifically and for firms specifically? Thank you.
I think that question was for Isabel first.
So I totally get the point that firms should have responsibilities, and obviously this is, but to me it's another set of questions which is somehow confused in the CSR literature, so minding for the democratization of firm does not prevent from thinking about the responsibilities that firm should have vis-a-vis various stakeholders or impacted or affected communities. And that is very clear. And I think that the legal scholarship here should be reconsidered, as it has indeed empowered a vision of the corporation as this legal, persona which has very elusive responsibilities, and in some ways maybe democratizing internally the political entity might actually affirm the boundaries, the actions, making them clearer, more visible, and that could help and go hand in hand with affirming the responsibilities of the firm, like externally, or in a relationship with its environment. This would be the way I would go. And on the second point, absolutely, the participatory literature in democratic theory is actually very relevant, as I think I already indicated, generally to the discussion about democratizing firms or understanding firms as political entities. Yet I would be cautious about thinking that process of pure, let's say, participatory mechanisms inside the firm would be enough to speak about a project of democratization. Here, obviously, I don't think that qualifies. It can be very actually good for worker satisfaction. We know that when workers, can bear on even small problems, small issues at the workplace, that makes a huge difference to them, to their well-being. So this is important, but it's obviously something that capitalism has always been very mindful of. And, involving workers through various participatory schemes is actually very old as a managerial tool. So what really is important here, I think, is to see those tools or those participatory schemes in the larger picture of what is the government system of that entity, and most of the time these participatory schemes can go without affecting the decisions, the power structure of the corporation, and that's where we have to obviously be very mindful, and so these schemes do not evacuate the need to think about the power structure.
All right, Ninhe, you want to comment?
Yeah, no, great. No, thanks for the question. And again, this comes back to, I think, one of the central themes that we've been sort of wrestling with is, if we think about democratizing decision-making within the corporation, whatever principle we have for it, how does that principle distinguish between workers and other constituencies? I think that's sort of roughly the kind of, that's basically the version of this question, right? And you're right, if it's about power exploitation, maybe it extends beyond workers. I guess there's one thing that we haven't talked about, which I think was touched upon your point, and it might be interesting. It's a line of thought that hasn't, is that workers actually are subject to authority in a way that other constituents aren't. Okay, so I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Christopher McMahon, but it's probably worth going back to his view that basically workers are subject to authority in a way that other constituents aren't, even though they may be subject to corporate power. And so that's sort of one argument that one might try to use in this more of what distinguishes workers as opposed to other parties sort of being subject to it. I personally go back and forth in this. I don't think workers are subject to authority in the same way as, but anyway, but that's another story. But that is an argument that you could also make to try to separate these things out.
Okay, then next is Rutger Klaassen.
Yes, thanks. This is really a wonderful discussion so far. I do want to sort of move up maybe a level, or take a step back maybe from our discussion, and imagine that we would walk into a seminar room in which there would be a program on corporate governance. Today's session was, the title was Corporate Governance, but the audience was lawyers, business people, etc. Probably during the 2 hours you would hear very, very little about worker representation. So today's discussions about corporate governance in all these other circles, at least seem to me to be coming to a sort of consensus that the firm or the corporation or both should have as their purpose to serve all stakeholders and not just shareholders. And there's, after the business roundtable, etc., there seems to be more of a consensus that the contractual protection of other stakeholders doesn't always work, and that others also bear risks that aren't sort of solved in their contracts with the corporation. So that we need to move away from just focusing on the interests of shareholders. But the solutions would be very different. So I think one main solution would be to say, well, the board has to independently represent these other interests in its decisions. The duties of directors, the fiduciary duties, should be taken as broader, but don't involve these stakeholders in actual representation. Of course, you might consult them, but no real shift of power there, because that would lead to politicization of debates and endless stalemates. If you want to do something else, well, maybe look at judges and make sure that the corporation is held accountable for its human rights violations in front of courts. Maybe look at shareholders and ask them to be more patient in the way that they manage their capital. Maybe put shares into the hands of foundations, as they do in Denmark, and make owners in that sense more responsible for all stakeholders. Maybe in the end, even look yet again at the state and whether it can regulate the corporation better. So any other solution but the solution that has been central today. So I would like you to reflect on whether any of these other solutions would make sense, but to give your diagnosis of why, if I walk in such another seminar room, these are probably the things that I would hear, or anyone would hear, instead of the discussion we had today.
Ninhe, would you like to go first on this?
Well, I think that's precisely because of Isabel's title of her talk is that employees aren't stakeholders. I mean, I think that's sort of, that is exactly why there's this difference between the two. I think that's sort of part of it. And what we've been talking about is not this other part. Now, look, this is where the caveat came in, what I mentioned earlier, right? Is that I think there are good arguments for consultation and representation, like you said. One could also imagine redefining legally what the purpose of the corporation is in a way that then requires directors to think about the best interests of the corporation in a way that isn't just simply about, shareholder interests. I think that's, and you could find ways to sort of hold them accountable for that. I think also stronger regulation, states, I think all that could matter as well. So I think that's right. I think we sort of diagnose. I think the point is that the term stakeholder representation is, yeah, well, I guess it's my own general, it gets to my general point, which I actually don't like the term stakeholder. I think it's not a very helpful term, actually. I think that's actually where I come down on this. So I'm not sure that answers your question, Rutger, but I think that's partly. So
the impetus behind the question is that I think in this debate, some of the concerns that have traditionally motivated looking at worker representation are now recognized, including the S in ESG, like the labor rights, and then the care for a higher minimum wage, for non-exploitative labor conditions. All of this is somewhat more recognized in mainstream debates under public pressure, the pressure of public opinion. But any other route is deemed better than actually changing the political structure of the corporation itself. And I think that is a sort of state of affairs that requires reflection if you want to make proposals that do go in that direction. Like, what are the hurdles?
Oh, what are the hurdles for doing that? Well, look, I think this comes back to, and that's why it's a question of, I think, to the very early question, the early point, it's about the relative position of capital in society, and the fact that people don't recognize that workers bear risk in ways that are greater than capital is just basically indicative of the way in which, well, it's called capitalism for a reason.
If I may follow up on that, absolutely, I fully second you. I think it's really, in my understanding, it's really about the fact that the democratic project, well, to put it in a positive way, needs to be strengthened. So the Article 1 of the human rights, the Universal Human Rights Declaration, all human beings are, equal in dignity and rights. It's clearly not the normative basis for thinking about those issues for many people. And so that room full of people would be a room full of people who actually think that capitalism is a best system compared to democracy. And I really see those two as two regimes of government. So these are not two propositions that, pertain to different social spheres. These are two propositions, two ways to govern people. One is to govern people based on the idea that we recognize each other as equal, and we are going to equip ourselves as societies with the institutions that are going to near approach that ideal, and will always fail because it's extremely difficult to build democratic institutions and a democratic government. And the other proposition is that political rights should be tied to ownership. And of course, if you think that is the proper way to organize power, you go for the capitalist route. And obviously, I don't think all capitalists understand that. Like, it's not, I don't think like it's necessarily a very properly understood project, but this is what it leads to. It leads to the fact that we don't recognize that firms are these political entities where property is what grants access to political rights and work does not, and that's it. And so tying back to the question, the question that Nehe had shared with us, like these two final questions, deep issues about, what if the distribution of the means of production was equal? What if they were publicly owned? I think our concern to have workers have the right to participate in the government of their firms would stand as clearly as that, because they need to be recognized not on the basis that they own like shares or that they own property to trigger the enjoyment of political rights, but it's based on our recognition as equals, and on that basis, indeed, citizens have to be the demos of the entity. And indeed, in the context of the firm, not everyone should be recognized a citizen in the firm. And I guess that's where like labor investors are those citizens, because they invest themselves and they are governed by the entity in a way that no other constituencies, stakeholders, communities is governed. Yeah, let me stop here.
Can I just jump in really quickly? I think so. This is where I think maybe there's some, because I do think that if capital or ownership privately were distributed quite evenly, that's where I come back and say, well, maybe actually that addresses our concern, in part because also to your question, why do people I think it's a question people debate is ultimately what would be the alternative to private ownership of the means of production in a way that that allowed capital. And there are many people, I think, who would argue that for reasons of consumer welfare is in fact advantageous, right? And also for other reasons. So that might be maybe why there's this barrier. People say, well, it's not clear what the alternative is, and so therefore let's sort of work within that system to sort of try to address these problems, and that would sort of lead you to, well, maybe thinking about this kind of more equal distribution of private capital. So that.
All right, then I have Mario Cunningham.
Thanks, Philippe. And thank you both for your presentations. I have a question for Isabel. So I'm really, let's say, surprised and in a good way by this category of labor investor as a way in which workers can be empowered. However, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the flip side of this picture? So because if we are thinking about empowering workers within the corporate structure, then I wonder if this goes hand in hand with a complete reconceptualization also of workers' duties. So if we accept that workers are fully invested in the work they do, and this is very important for how a firm works, then if they withdraw their labor by going to another firm, should there be some imposition of, I don't know, maybe a fee, because they have been getting some special training that is going to be very important for this corporation? Or also, if the company is doing really bad and is not efficient, then should wages go back down in a corporation that is democratic? Or how do you conceptualize this other aspect of the duties that would go hand in hand with empowering workers?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've not done the whole work. So this is a huge avenue, obviously, to rethink basically the whole labor code, because our current systems of wage work indeed do not include any any such duties because it presumes subordination. And I guess I would look at the way worker cooperatives, for instance, work. It's very interesting to see that in Spain, for instance, the largest cooperative firm, which is a corporation actually in the world, Mondragon, faced the economic crisis of 2008, was very interesting. They decided that they wanted that no worker lose his job. And obviously, as they had been saving money more than capitalist firms, because they had not spent the previous years before the crisis to buy back shares to increase the price of those shares, they had some savings that they could put in these sort of private unemployment schemes to keep everybody employed. They have a commitment towards each of the workers, of the 70,000 workers of the cooperative group, that if in one of the firm your job would be redundant, the group has this commitment to hire you in some other firm. So all this obviously has to be reconsidered. All the capitalist and market-based relationships that we know today are up for reconsideration in a world of democratic firms. But I guess that's the fun part of it, to think about all that and how societies could face also the challenges that would come with that, including the potential problems, to address them and find solutions to them. So thank you for your question.
I just jump in here, Mario. You point to, I think, in a really important part, which is this is a potential issue, which is the asymmetry between capital, financial capital, and labor, right? Which is that basically it's very difficult to disentangle human capital from the natural person, and can't alienate and sort of restrict the freedom of people. And there are lots of attempts that people have made to actually try to turn themselves, like, securitizing my future stream of earnings. From a financial perspective, that'd be great to be able to do for some sports athletes, right? But from the perspective of freedom and binding yourself, that seems like completely goes against every thought we have about respecting human freedom. So I think that also, I think maybe your question is sort of getting at this kind of asymmetry that also does introduce, I think, some complications in thinking about this issue. So I think that's a great point.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, and last on my list is Jeroen.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. I'm not sure whether I can actually formulate my question in 4 minutes, but I'll try. So the sort of the general impetus for my comment would be comments made by Leo Strine not too long ago, and he's been a massive voice for employee rights, obviously after the fact and after he stood down as being the Chief Justice for Delaware. But some of his comments echo stuff that has come out, for instance, by Katerina Pistor on the Code of Capital, but also the sort of longer history of critical legal studies, in which the idea is that law actually provides this institution that embeds all these relations to a very large degree. And what sort of emerges out of that debate is that law is both constitutive, but it's also extremely exclusive of anything that has to do with employees. So employees are not a direct element of a corporation. They are excluded from company law. They're only included through other means, for instance, by labor law or other means, but they're definitely not a relevant constituency for anybody dealing with company law, right? So company law constitutes a corporation as something that doesn't include employees in the first instance. We have to sort of find all sorts of ways to include them from the other side. seen from that way, there is no analogy between political theory and company law. It's just two different worlds. It's two different ways of constituting any type of corporate actor, right? So starting from that perspective, it might be illuminating to sort of look at the implicit structure that company lawyers employ to deal with different types of constituencies. And from there on to see what they employ to bring in other types of constituencies and what way that then functions, right? So employees are only brought in through labor law, and then you can have something like employee representation that functions, for instance, in the Netherlands and in Germany in different ways, because, for instance, employee representatives in Germany can have a fiduciary duty towards, and they can act on a fiduciary duty towards their actual constituency, which is labor. In the Netherlands, they cannot, which makes it a massive difference in terms of how you can actually represent that particular constituency within that structure. So the structure that you create through law becomes something that is so massively important to this debate. And I've been missing that in the debates up until now. By consequence, even if you conceive of the corporation as something that becomes constituted through the lens of something like team production theory or whatever, it is not a polity. It is simply not a polity, and you cannot approach it as such. That then brings you back to the topic of representation. And representation, if you bring it in externally, as Trine has been arguing, can be done in two ways. Either you change company law, right, and you bring it in structurally, or you do it by strengthening all the adjacent areas of law. You do that in a very heavy-handed way. That is one. The other thing is, if you bring in employee representation specifically as something that brings in other interests, you will find that most people that are actually employee representatives will not accept that idea. So in the Netherlands, they try to do it in the law by saying that employee representatives would also bring in sustainability interests into the firm on the board level, but they were cut short by employee representatives. Right, I'll just stop it there. I'm just saying the legal perspective should really play a decisive role in this debate, I think. There you go.
Does anyone of you two want to comment on this?
Well, my understanding is that we spent the time to descriptively look at the reality in order to challenge precisely the legal structures that indeed are massively determining the outputs today, yet they are ideologically constructed and certainly do not reflect reality, nor do they fit the democratic project as a whole. So this is what I would say, just to be short.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I think I guess the question is, why take company law existing as it is as a starting point for a discussion? And if it's a question of trying to make reform within that context, what's feasible or not, that'd be one reason. Another reason, as Isabel's pointed out, well, here's what it is, and then sort of how do we challenge it? But I guess the question is, from a perspective of political theory, what are the good arguments for company law as it is? And that sort of goes back to, I think, Rutger's question, other questions, why is there something about the existing form of the corporation that has normative justification independently of how we think about what the existing law is? And people make these arguments, right? There are arguments, economists make arguments for that and things like that. And so that's maybe what we want to take on board. And maybe that's sort of something that needs to be taken on board more. And on the question of what the other side is. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Again, huge thank you to our two speakers. It was a pleasure, and I think a great presentation, a great discussion. And yeah, I wish you all a wonderful afternoon or rest of the day. In 2 weeks, we'll have a workshop with Chi Kwok's paper, and in 4 weeks, we'll have another seminar session on corporations and capitalism, and we hope many of you join us there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. This was really learned a lot.
Thank you, me too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Have a good evening or day, afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.